So Lehua, Donna, Inga, thank you very much indeed. Look, let's get straight to the point here, as we're coming at this from a variety of different angles with you. And Inga, I'm going to start, if I can, with your perspective, because I think your background covers everything with regard to the environment, and that includes drought in the Sahel, for example, and agricultural challenges on land. Have we reached the point, do you think, where people still need persuading that what is going on in the ocean is absolutely pivotal to what happens on the land?
Well, I think that people have become very much aware of the imperatives of taking care of the oceans. Obviously, young voices, youth voices, young leaders have raised this point, but coastal communities and coastal societies and countries have also raised it, particularly obviously small island states, and those who rely heavily on the blue economy. Because what we need to understand is that as we have seen our interference with the Earth's systems through climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, we have not understood sufficiently and are now beginning to understand that the very, very connection that we have with the oceans is one that is basic to our very existential, to our very existence. Without the oceans, we will not have our weather regulatory system. Without the oceans, we would not be able to feed so much of humanity relying on the oceans for nutrients. Without the oceans being in good health, we would not be able to sustain the civilization of people as we know it. And we need to understand maybe also that what have really gotten people revolted and disgusted is the way we've treated the oceans like a trash can. We've thrown in our garbage, our plastics, etc., our nutrient runoff, our nitrogen runoff from farmers' fields, thereby polluting it. And we've seen these pictures that most children and young adults would have seen of birds feeding plastics to their young, of turtles with a straw in their nostril, of fishes full of plastic in their bellies. So that, I think, has also been a call to action. Now, my last point with PPE, which we need, I understand, but I'm afraid that we've seen a little bit of a regression on how far we had come. So it's very important that, yes, we protect ourselves in this pandemic, but also equally important that we take care and manage the waste properly.
Donna, let me come to you. You run the Bertarelli Foundation for Marine Conservation. You're also an ocean-going sailor. I mean, you love the water for it's part of your life as well. Where do you, as a philanthropist, fit into this equation,
though? Well, I think philanthropists are really visionaries, driven by a passion and an inspiration to bring positive change. There are in many instances pioneers ready to take risks, test and fail, at the forefront of research, development, innovation, exploration, in a way which hasn't been done by other sectors. I think they provide essential seed money for proof of concept to projects that wouldn't otherwise exist, or fund essential long-term ones that wouldn't otherwise be sustainable. They act quickly, unlock resources, share access to networks, data, and knowledge. And I've learned from that, and I've built on the legacy my parents left me, adopting a business-like approach where results matter, and science provides the roadmap for action. And I like solutions that can be scalable, sustainable, and self-sustaining, and also enjoy working in partnerships, learning from others, and not reinventing the wheel if a better solution exists.
Yeah, I think that point about partnerships is going to be crucial. But it's interesting, you gave that example, risk, test, fail, but also on a business-like footing. How easy is it for you to marry those two things?
Well, you have to, because I think it's Mark Carney that said that companies that will not invest into looking and mitigating climate change and becoming carbon neutral will not succeed in the coming years.
Let's bring in Lehua now, which is a different perspective, clearly, Lehua. You're with the Polynesian Voyaging Society. You are traveling around the world, representing indigenous communities as you go, and spelling out partly what your needs are, what your expectations are. Do you feel part of this discussion?
I think, well, actually, maybe just to go back a second there, as we voyage around, we sail on a double-hulled canoe built in the tradition of our ancestors here in Hawaii and Polynesia. And I don't want to say, we're representing all Indigenous communities and people, but I want to hope that we are always making sure they are a priority and the first people we meet when we travel to a new place. I think some part of this conversation is around including more diverse and being respectful of other worldviews, perspectives of science, and understanding the earth and the ocean and nature that allow us to not only see the data and the graphs and all of the information that help us make decisions, but also really understand the stories and the emotions that go into why these places are important. When we navigate out at sea, we are really just living scientific instruments. And I think that goes for many people who are immersed in nature in their work, whether they be navigators, fishermen, hunters, trackers. In many Indigenous communities, these are roles that are incredibly respected. And each one of those individuals takes in information and gifts from nature and is responsible for acting on what they see. And so if something is amiss, if the information shows that, we're getting plastic pollution or that the animals aren't where they're supposed to be, there's so many ways that you see things that might be amiss. You also have a responsibility to act.
So, Inga, let me bring that back to you, that sense of involving all parties. Critically important, isn't it? I'm going to introduce the private sector in just a moment, but I think Lehua comes from a very clear community that needs to be heard if there is to be an overarching, if you like, holistic solution here.
Absolutely. There's so much that we can learn from Indigenous communities and people who, as Lehua said so beautifully, live closer to nature, because the truth is that in more quote unquote modern societies where we have urbanized, we've become so far removed. Nature is in a supermarket shelf at times. And so we've become so far removed that we have forgotten those systems. My grandmother was born north of the polar circle in the final years of the 1800s in a small fishing village. And I had the privilege of knowing her in her older age. And there is so much that I learned from her. And I think understanding, irrespective of where people come from, but understanding that connectedness to nature is a voice that needs to be heard, which is why, of course, when it comes to the authenticity of some of the voices that we hear in what otherwise could very quickly be negotiations around square brackets, there is an authenticity of voices that come from people who can speak with that clarity.
Yeah, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to put a sort of overall value on the ocean, Donna, isn't it? But you put time, effort, and funding into specific projects. Just give me an example of the sort of thing you're doing.
Well, we do many things, but at first I just wanted to pick up on what Inger said. I think the problem that we have today is that we see the value of the ocean only when we extract its resource. We don't put any value in the ocean, for what it is, the mangroves, the biodiversity, the animals in it, and all the services and benefits that this biodiversity brings to life as we know it on Earth. Without all of that biodiversity, we will not be able to breed or feed or drink. So all of that we know. But the problem remains that at the higher level, and even I want to say on the general public level, even though the concept seems to be quite simple, it is actually quite complex. And the relationship between ocean health and climate, or ocean health and our own health, human health, is still not really, the narrative is still not yet really well understood.
And Donna, where you talk about human health and the ocean, it's interesting that I've been speaking to Denis Duverne. Denis is the chairman of the insurance group AXA, so a major private sector organization with good reason to look at reasons of human health and well-being and safety that climate change can affect. And I asked him, first of all, why it was so important for the private sector to be involved.
So as you know, AXA is an insurance company. And for AXA, the business case is very clear. In the last decade alone, insurers have paid $300 billion for coastal storm damage. And we know this will become worse because the ocean health is declining. It will bring about new risk, more uncertainty. And it is expected by 2050, rising sea levels and extreme weather on the coastline will cost up to $1 trillion annually. There is ocean warming, acidification, deoxygenation, which will have many implications from flood hazards to food security, to national security and global trade. So health is important because we are a big health insurer, and many compounds in the fight against cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer, arthritis, other conditions comes from products of the sea, including corals, and AXA therefore is very interested. But also we are conscious of the moral need, and I mean our purpose takes this into account. So we have many reasons to care about it.
Yeah, and that moral need is actually also a reputational need, to be honest, isn't it, these days? You have to do these things. Absolutely.
As an insurer, we are very conscious of this. We were among the first to ring the bell on climate change. Our previous CEO, Henri Decazes, talked about the fact that the 4-degree world was not insurable. We fund research on risk because we believe that increasing academic knowledge about risk makes those risks more insurable. And in the last decade, we've funded more than, close to 30 projects related to ocean situation and marine biodiversity for more than €4 million.
I mean, if we're talking about yourself within the insurance sector, that you might want to be engaged in coastal communities, for example, but very specific areas where your interests are best served as well.
Absolutely. So we are involved, and we now co-chair the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, which is a multi-sector effort to drive $500 million of investment into coastal natural capital by 2030. We also support the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Index, which identifies key risk areas in coastal regions. So we try to be very active there, and also to work with policymakers, public and private investors, and the insurance industry to form coalitions to be more effective.
How valuable is it to you to hear even voices from the private sector there saying, we've got to be a partnership, we have to do this as an alliance, as a collective group?
It helps us to believe and to have the hope that we can come together around these solutions. Anything that involves the ocean, I think, always takes a little bit more than you're willing to give. You have to sit with it. You have to sit with these communities beyond what you're probably comfortable with. You have to invest in them more than you thought you would. We sailed around the world in 2014, and we got home in 2017. It was 3 years, and that was really just an introduction to so many voices, so many humble, quiet, powerful, strong voices.
Yeah, and you mentioned the next steps. Inge, we've got a decade of ocean science here. It is imperative, isn't it, when you listen to Lehua, that by the end of this decade, those sorts of issues are resolved, that there really is genuine movement towards a collective approach to this.
No, absolutely. This one species, humankind, we've altered about 66% of the oceans, and we've done so callously and not understanding the broader role that oceans play. Oceans are this innocence, right? Because they just receive. We emit too much CO2. The oceans can't reject it. They will just take it in. So this decade, there are things that need to happen now in this decade. This year, 2021, we're going to have the conference of the parties for the Convention for Biodiversity. We're going to have to agree on a new goal for a whole host of things. The goals that we agreed 10 years ago, we've not lived up to. We have to now deliver. And we have to deliver not by every year so as to arrive at a healthy planet. We're going to have COP26. And I find it remarkable that it is 27 years so we have had these, where we'd had the conventions, more than a quarter of a century, and we're still struggling with what we knew in COP1 was a problem, namely to reduce our CO2 footprint. So now is the time to really make this happen, and to make this happen with urgency. Failure is simply not an option, because if we look at the pandemic and what the pandemic has done to us, climate change and biodiversity loss and infinite pollution is of a completely different scale. So let's understand that, you know, there is a vaccine for the pandemic, but there is no vaccine for the planet. There's only action.
Right, yeah, and that brings governments into the equation, of course. Donna, there is clearly a ring of some frustration from Inga as well there. In the work you've been doing, though, give us a sense of how you feel about the future, the next generation, and the sense of progress being made, of which you are a part as a philanthropist.
I think progress has been made and continues to go in, and thank God we have science that tells us and gives us the pathway on how to act and what are the things to be done. One of them is to protect strongly or fully 30% of the ocean by 2030, and I hope we will be able to meet that deadline. The frustration still exists that I don't think that our governments or even the general public on a global scale, really on a global scale, irrespective from a developed or developing country, is sufficiently informed about the connection about ocean health and why it is so important. And as a consequence, the ocean is not front and center when we discuss policies, when we make regulations, when we do investments, we negotiate trade deals or education, or even on our institutions, and especially when it comes to commitments and actions. And I think that's where we need much more effort. And I think the narrative needs to be clear. And I think all those concepts that we all know because we are kind of specialists, we need to make it much clearer for most of the people, irrespective if we're educated or not educated. I think the local people, the Rapa Nui, the Polynesian, you know, they know because they leave the ocean every single day and they see what's going on. They have seen it for decades. And now we also have the science that tells us this since decades. So now really it's at the level of policies and our governments to act and commit in the protection of the ocean for future and for a blue economy. There won't be a sustainable blue economy if we don't protect the ocean.
Donna, very clear words and very forcefully put. Thank you. Lehua, I'm going to give you the last word. A shout out now. We've got thousands of people listening in. We've got a world that needs to pay attention. What would you say to them?
The ocean is no one's ocean, but it's really all of our home. And just coming from someone who is surrounded by it every day, who spends weeks on end sailing across it, I think if we all understand its role in our survival, how it connects us all together, we start to put our minds and our hearts in the right place to make good decisions for it, because we will all benefit with a healthy ocean.
That is a very clear message and emotionally put. Lehua, Donna, Inga, thank you all very much indeed.